It began as a small conflict in a distant jungle and became one of the most divisive, bloody, and misunderstood wars in modern history. From the dense rainforests of Vietnam to the streets of Washington, D.C., the Vietnam War shaped a generation and left scars that are still felt today. This is the story of how America entered a war it couldn't win, how a small nation became the center of a global Cold War struggle, and why, after 20 years of fighting, millions were dead, and nothing was truly the same. Before American troops ever set foot in Vietnam, the country had already been fighting for independence for nearly a century. Vietnam was part of French Indochina, a French colony since the mid-1800s. The Vietnamese people, led by nationalist movements, wanted freedom, and among those leaders was a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho was educated abroad, in France, even the Soviet Union, and he believed Vietnam's liberation would come through communism. When World War II broke out, Japan invaded and took control of Indochina. But when Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh saw his chance. On September 2nd, 1945, standing in Hanoi, he declared Vietnam's independence, quoting directly from the American Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal." He called his new nation the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the French weren't ready to let go. Within months, they returned to reclaim their colony, and Vietnam was thrown into war once again. The French, with tanks, planes, and Western backing, fought against Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, guerrilla fighters using hit-and-run tactics. It was a brutal, grinding conflict, and over time, it became a test between colonial power and revolutionary nationalism. By the early 1950s, France was losing control, and the United States, locked in the early stages of the Cold War, was watching closely. To American leaders, Ho Chi Minh wasn't a nationalist. He was a communist puppet of Moscow and Beijing. President Truman sent millions in military aid to the French, believing that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Asia might follow, the beginning of what would be called the domino theory. But no amount of money could save the French. In 1954, at a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, Vietnamese forces surrounded and crushed the French garrison. It was a stunning victory, the first time an Asian revolutionary army had defeated a major European power. France withdrew. Vietnam was divided in two. The Geneva Accords split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, ruled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government in Hanoi, and the South, led by a Western-backed regime in Saigon under Ngo Dinh. Elections were supposed to reunite the country, but Diem, with American support, refused to hold them. He feared that Ho Chi Minh, popular across Vietnam, would easily win. The U.S. saw Diem as a bulwark against communism, but he was corrupt, authoritarian, and Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. Protests grew, repression worsened, and in the countryside, a new guerrilla movement emerged, the Viet Cong, or National Liberation Front, supported by the North. The seeds of America's war in Vietnam had been planted. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he saw Vietnam as the front line of the Cold War. To contain communism, the U.S. sent military advisors, helicopters, and training teams, but not yet combat troops. By 1963, over 16,000 Americans were in Vietnam. Still, the situation was collapsing. The Viet Cong controlled more and more villages, and Diem's regime was losing all legitimacy. In November 1963, South Vietnamese generals, with Washington's tacit approval, overthrew and killed Diem. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated. Vietnam would now become the problem of a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. In August 1964, American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The incident, partly misinterpreted, partly exaggerated, gave Johnson the excuse he needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to defend U.S. forces and allies. It was effectively a blank check for war. Within months, the first combat troops arrived in Vietnam. By 1965, the U.S. was fully committed, and a new phase had begun. In March 1965, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. For 3 years, American planes dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all sides had used in World War II combined. But bombing couldn't stop guerrilla warfare. The North simply dug deeper tunnels, hid supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and used the jungle as a shield. Meanwhile, U.S. ground forces poured into South Vietnam. By the end of 1965, over 200,000 American troops were in country. By 1968, that number would exceed 500,000. Vietnam was unlike any war America had fought before. There were no clear front lines. The enemy could be anywhere, in the rice fields by day, in the jungles by night. Villages that seemed peaceful could hide Viet Cong fighters or booby traps. To measure success, U.S. commanders relied on body counts, a grim metric that turned human lives into statistics. American soldiers called it the meat grinder. Helicopters became the lifeline of the war, carrying troops into combat zones and lifting the wounded out. And everywhere, the jungle fought back with leeches, snakes, and the unseen enemy. In response, the U.S. used napalm, Agent Orange, and other defoliants to strip away foliage and deny the Viet Cong cover. The landscape turned to mud. The rivers ran orange, villages burned, and yet the Viet Cong kept coming. By early 1968, U.S. commanders claimed victory was near. Then, on January 30th, during the Vietnamese New Year, Tet, the enemy launched a massive surprise attack across the country. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops struck cities, bases, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive was a disaster for the North. They lost tens of thousands of fighters, but psychologically, it shattered America's illusion of progress. The war that Washington said was being won clearly wasn't. Television brought the chaos into American living rooms. For the first time, Americans saw war as it really was: burning villages, screaming civilians, body bags. Public opinion turned sharply against the war. Student protests erupted across the country, and President Johnson, worn down and politically broken, announced he would not seek re-election. In 1969, Richard Nixon entered the White House promising peace with honor. His strategy was called Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while training South Vietnamese forces to take over the fight. Behind the scenes, Nixon also expanded the war, secretly bombing communist sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. The idea was to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and pressure the North to negotiate. Instead, it widened the conflict. By 1970, over 4 million tons of bombs had fallen on Indochina. Entire villages in Cambodia were erased. The war was spreading, not ending. At home, outrage grew, protests turned violent. In May 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on students at Kent State University, killing 4. The image of young Americans dying, both abroad and at home, became a symbol of a nation tearing itself apart. Peace negotiations began in Paris, but both sides stalled. In 1972, the North launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion of the South. Nixon retaliated with the linebacker air campaigns, devastating Hanoi and Haiphong with B-52 bombers. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The US agreed to withdraw its remaining forces. The North promised to release American prisoners of war. But the fighting between North and South Vietnam never really stopped. As the last American troops left, Saigon's survival depended entirely on US money, supplies, and air support, which were all about to disappear. Without American boots on the ground, South Vietnam began to crumble. In early 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled south in a final, unstoppable offensive. City after city fell. By April, they reached Saigon. On April 30th, 1975, as North Vietnamese troops entered the capital, American helicopters lifted the last evacuees from the U.S. Embassy roof. The images of desperate South Vietnamese clinging to the skids of helicopters became iconic, a symbol of America's failure to save its allies. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. After 20 years of conflict, the Vietnam War was over. Communist forces had unified the country, but at an unimaginable cost. By the end, the numbers were staggering. 58,000 Americans dead, over 300,000 wounded, 2 million Vietnamese civilians killed, 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers dead, entire regions poisoned by defoliants, generations traumatized. The war had cost the U.S. over $150 billion and shattered the public's trust in government. For many veterans, returning home brought no peace, only questions and silence. The Vietnam War wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological one. It forced the United States to question its role as the world's policeman and made future interventions far more cautious. It gave birth to the term Vietnam Syndrome, America's fear of getting trapped in another endless, unwinnable war. For Vietnam itself, the aftermath was equally complex. The country was reunified but devastated. In the years that followed, it faced famine, poverty, and isolation until it began rebuilding in the late 1980s. Today, Vietnam is peaceful, young, and thriving. Yet reminders of the war remain. In bomb craters, in jungles still contaminated by Agent Orange, and in the memories of those who lived through it. The Vietnam War was never just a clash of ideologies. It was a clash of perspectives. Between empires and peasants, between technology and terrain, between truth and illusion. It showed that the most powerful military on Earth could not defeat an enemy with patience, will, and home field advantage. It showed that victory on paper means nothing when you lose hearts and minds, and it proved, once again, that in war, everyone loses something. For the people of Vietnam, for the soldiers who fought, for those who never came home, and for those who still remember, the war may be over, but the echoes never fade.